Hello, my name's Becky Chester. I'm consultant nurse for people with a learning disability. I'd just like to welcome you into this conversation with learning disability nurses. And this is the final of the webinars that the Royal College of Nursing have been running on the history of learning disability nursing. I'm really excited that today we're going to be joined by three absolutely inspirational learning disability nurse leaders. We've got Professor Ruth Northway with us, who is the Professor of Learning Disability Nursing in the Faculty of Sciences and Education in the University of South Wales. Professor Kay Mafuba, who is the Professor of Learning Disability Nursing in the University of West London, and Professor Michael Brown, who is the Professor of Nursing and Director of Graduate Studies in the School of Nursing and Midwifery at Queen University, Belfast. So we've got a fantastic opportunity really to understand from Ruth and Kay and Michael their experiences of learning disability nursing throughout their careers. So really excited to have them with us this evening. Just before we go into the webinar and the discussion and the conversations that we're going to be having today, just want to welcome you all to the webinar. It's great to have you here and great to have such great representation from across the countries. But also just to remind you that the Royal College of Nursing is a UK membership organisation, but actually it's really great to have people potentially with us from across the world as well as we share practice and learn from each other. Many of you are probably very familiar with Zoom, but just a couple of things that I just wanted to make you aware of as we go through this evening. So if we could just ask attendees to make sure that their microphones are muted, and also if we could ask people to turn their cameras off just so that we can reduce the bandwidth, that would be greatly appreciated. There will be an opportunity as part of the webinar to ask questions, and we will do that towards the end of the event. But if people would like to ask a question, please use the electronic hand under reactions, or please do type your questions into the chat as well. If we could ask you to type the questions towards the end of the discussion, just so that it doesn't distract the speakers, that would be appreciated. If you're having any problems with Zoom, I know that I often have technical problems. The easiest thing to do is probably to come out of the Zoom meeting and then click the link to rejoin. I do tend to find that turning things on and off helps greatly. So if you could try that in the first instance, and hopefully any difficulties you're having will be resolved. There will be some automatically generated captions during the talk. If you would like to turn those off, then you can click on the CC button, and that will give you the option to either show or to hide the subtitles. As I said, I'm really excited to welcome you to this event, and just this opportunity really to talk with three learning disability nurse leaders who I know throughout my career have inspired me. I'm sure that they've inspired you as well. You know, I think we're very lucky to have the wealth of knowledge that we've got with us this evening. I'm just going to ask each of our panel members to introduce themselves and to tell us a little bit about their background as learning disability nurses, and about how they decided to become a learning disability nurse, and a little bit about their training. And if you could tell us also a little bit about what your first day was like as a learning disability nurse. I know it might be a little while ago, but I still vividly remember mine, and I'm sure you do yours as well. So if you could share that with us, that would be greatly appreciated. And if you could tell us a little bit about some of the most interesting roles that you've worked in as well. So to start us off, I'm going to come across to yourself, Professor Ruth Northway.
Okay, thank you, Becky, and welcome everybody. Good to have you here this evening. I think I've been set the biggest memory test because I think I probably have to remember the furthest back out of the three of us. But in terms of why did I decide to become a learning disability nurse? In a way, I probably ended up being a learning disability nurse by accident. But just to put that in context, I knew I wanted to work with people with learning disabilities when I left school. And I considered a number of different routes. And one of the ones which I was sort of thinking about was being a social worker. And at that time, you couldn't start your social work training until you're 20, and I was only 18. So the question then was, what do you do with 2 years? So very close to where I lived, there were a couple of long stay hospitals for people with learning disabilities. And I thought, okay, what I could do is a couple of years working as a nursing assistant, get some experience, and then go and do my social work course. But then somebody said to me, well, if you're going to do 2 years as a nursing assistant, why not just do 3 and do your nursing qualification? So I thought, okay, let's give that a go. But even then, it wasn't certain I was going to end up as a learning disability nurse, because I started my training on the 16th of July in 1979. And as some of you will remember, 1979 is quite a significant year in terms of learning disability nursing, because it was the year the J report came out. And so I was interviewed for nursing, and it was on the basis of, well, you might start your training as a learning disability nurse, but come the end, you might never get to work as a learning disability nurse. Now, for me, that wasn't an issue, because I wanted to work with people with a learning disability. That was my starting point. So I thought, okay, let's do this. So started, as I said, July 1979. When I think about how much things have changed, I think even just education has changed. It was in a school of nursing, which was attached to a hospital. But the School of Nursing was a big house on the edge of Dawlish. If you've ever been on a holiday, you'll know it's probably a nice spot to be having your nurse education. But basically, we were, a group of 5, and you were in study blocks for a little while, and then you went out onto various placements. I think we were the first group that had to do the placement in general hospitals, which was, I think, quite interesting for us and very interesting for our colleagues in the general hospitals when they had us arrive on the wards. But did my 3 years, and after that I worked as a staff nurse down in Devon for probably about a couple of years, and then I moved up to Aylesbury, and had a couple of roles there. Firstly, in the hospital doing day activity work, and then setting up a community team and moving into community nursing. Moved down to Wales and worked as a clinical nurse specialist in community nursing, and then moved into nurse education. And obviously I've been in nurse education for quite a long time, but even there, things have changed dramatically over the years that I've been involved, going from schools of nursing into universities and various changes in the courses. What was my first day like? Well, my first day was obviously in a study block, and I can still remember the afternoon lecture was on ethics and etiquette. And basically, I think was focused on we should be polite to people that we met. But then my first day on a ward was very memorable, because I started, I think, at 7 o'clock in the morning. We then started to work, get people up. But by 8 o'clock, I'd been moved to a different ward to work on because they were short-staffed. And so I was catapulted into another ward, which I didn't know, wasn't expecting. And I think there was me and 2 qualified staff who were caring for, I think it's probably between about 35 and 40 men with quite severe, profound multiple disabilities. So it's quite a baptism of fire, my first day. In terms of some of the roles I had, one of the questions we were asked to think about was what are the most interesting roles I've worked in? And I think for me, it's probably whichever role I'm in at the time, because I've been really, really lucky to have lots of different experiences, lots of different settings, and to work with a lot of great people. And having been told, 43 years ago, I might not work as a learning disability nurse, 43 years later, I'm still here as one. So I think that probably just gives you an overview of what I've done.
That's fantastic. Thank you ever so much. And I think somebody's popped into the chat as well that they started their training in 1977. So we're in good company, Ruth, this evening. And I'm sure people that are able to share some of those experiences that you just shared with us. Kay, could I come across to you next, please?
Yes, of course. Yeah. Yes, good evening, everyone. I'm Kay Mafuba. As Rebecca said, I'm Professor of Learning Disability Nursing at the University of West London. So how did I become a learning disability nurse? A bit like Ruth. That was almost like accidental, but not in the same way. I enrolled for adult nursing at the beginning of the course, and with theory before we went into practice. And I will start when I actually transferred from the adult nursing part of the course to to following the learning disabilities route. So obviously what happened, I was the first intake to transfer to university in 1992. I started my course in 1992 when colleges of nursing transferred to university. So in terms of how the course started, it was quite chaotic really, because here universities or colleges had just been turned into universities. So there was a lot of overlap between the functions of the college transferring into the functions of the university. So it was quite chaotic really the very first year of the course. And also one of the things which happened when I was training, I trained at the University of Greenwich, which was just sort of emerging from several colleges, which were all located in different locations. So the way we attended sessions were, some of them were in London, in central London, some of them in southeast London, and some of them all the way in Kent. So we used to shuttle between London and Kent to attend session at all different locations. For example, I remember we had to go for biology sessions in Deptford, which is in southeast London. And then for things to do with the preparation for practice, we had to go to Dartford in the middle of Norway. So it was quite chaotic really to start. So what happened then, why I then decided to move from adult to learning disabilities, that of course we obviously, Ruth explained earlier on that they were the very first students to do placements in all sort of branches as they were called then. We also did the same. So students, you had to have experiences in all the other branches before you actually specialize in your own chosen branch. So with 18 months of what was called Common Foundation Program, and then 18 months of branch specific learning. And what happened is, on my very first placement in an adult ward, I was sent to an orthopedic ward for elderly people with fractured hips and fractured legs and the law. And my experience, I considered it to be awful at the time. One, because I just come from Africa, and where I come from, we treat elderly people as valuable members of society. And the attitudes I saw in the acute ward did not sit well with me at all culturally. So on the very first day in this placement, I went to my personal tutor to complain about what I had seen and that I wanted to leave the course. And I just couldn't handle the way elderly people were being treated, the way nurses were talking about elderly people. I remember very well an experience with a doctor, a junior doctor, who told me about a patient who had a note to say, "Do not resuscitate" on their file. And I questioned why they were doing it. And at the time, of course, in the 90s, there wasn't a lot of service user or patient involvement in decision making. It was all about the doctor making a decision and just writing notes on the file is what nurses are supposed to do. So I actually challenged this junior doctor and say, "This is not acceptable. It's not something we would do in our society." And the response was, "This is an old lady. Would you want to resuscitate an old lady?" And that, I found that absolutely unbearable and appalling. So I actually said, "No, this course is not for me." I went to my personal tutor the next day, who happened to be a learning disabilities nurse. And I said, "I'm going to leave the course." And that's it. I made up my mind. He said, "No, have you considered learning disability nursing?" And at the time, of course, I didn't know what learning disability nursing was at the time. All I was aware of was adult nursing or mental health nursing. I had very little knowledge about learning disability nursing. So she spoke to me about it in length, about the opportunities in learning disabilities and learning disability nursing. And the very next day, she offered to take me to a residential home for people with learning disabilities to meet learning disability nurses. And we went. She actually took me in her car because she didn't want me to leave the course. And we went there, and I met these wonderful nurses who I will never forget, who made a lasting impression on me about what a nurse needs to look at when you are looking at people. And one of the things I learned, which I never forget, is that people are people first and their patients next. So it's about what I learned from that was actually you need to look at people before you look at them as patients. And I think that's, to me, that gave me an impression about what nursing or what learning disability nursing is all about. It's about looking at people as people first and then patients next. So
It's absolutely fantastic, Kay. It sounds as though your tutor really picked up strength of your advocacy skills within those very early stages of your nurse training and recognised where you needed to be.
yeah, no, she did, and she was a wonderful nurse in the end. And I have to say that since then I never regretted anything about why I decided to become a learning disability nurse, and I've had a wonderful experience throughout my career. So that's how I became a learning disability nurse, and obviously, um, I she actually moved me from that ward where I had such a horrible experience. She argued that I needed to be changed to another environment. In fact, I ended up being moved to a placement with a health visitor who was working in the community with people with the sickle cell and stuff like that. And that actually helped me to actually settle into becoming a student and finishing my course as a nurse. And I already mentioned where I trained. I trained at the University of Greenwich, and which is in South London. At the time, of course, there was a transition from colleges, various colleges, which made up the University of Greenwich. What was my first day like? And I think I've already said that in terms of my academic learning, I was coming from a society where I had very little knowledge about nursing. And as I said, it was quite chaotic because of the changes which were going on, colleges becoming universities and colleges of nursing transferring into universities. When I became a qualified nurse, I took a job in an acute assessment and treatment unit for people with learning disabilities. Um, and really, during my training, I had very little experience in acute mental health because most of my placements were very much community focused in residential homes for people with challenging behavior, but not I did not have any experience of dealing with people with mental health problems under section and stuff like that. So when I started the job, it was really a baptism of fire in the sense that the level of aggression I met, I never thought I would ever experience that in a learning disability setting, because I always associated a lot of violence with acute mental health in a sort of generic mental health service. But it was quite challenging for me. And the reason why I took that job, it was a little bit away from home. I trained in Greenwich and I went to work in West London for some people who might know, which is what is now Central Northwest London Foundation Trust, or CNWL. That's where I took a job. And the reason why I took that job was that they were providing opportunities for people with ambition to go to further training. So I actually took it because I wanted to do a master's, which they were paying for. Of course, at the time, the NHS had a lot of money to support training. So on the very first day, I met the hospital manager, who was very nice at the time. And as part of the induction, and explained to us what is it that which were going to be offered within the trust. So on the one hand, this experience of baptism of fire in the ward, at the same time, I was very much excited about the opportunities for development, for further development, which they were offering me. So although I found the experience in the ward at the time quite challenging, I was so much enthusiastic as well at the same time about the opportunities for further development I was being given by the organization. So it was almost like a very mixed experience, or two extremes. One sort of experience a lot of aggression, which I was not prepared for, having to restrain people. I remember on the second day, we actually had to restrain a service user almost constantly for the whole day, because of the sort of the level of aggression they were presenting, and medication which they were being given wasn't working. So it was quite challenging. But um, all in all, it was really a very good experience in that it helped me to develop very quickly in terms of my clinical skills, because one of my managers taught me that you only develop if you learn to deal with problems. if you don't problem solve, you're not going to develop clinically, you're not going to develop in terms of your knowledge. So I found that really very useful right at the beginning of my career in terms of learning how to problem solve and how to develop your thinking skills and your decision-making skills. So I found that really very useful.
Thank you, Kay.
Yeah.
I think working within assessment and treatment services is a different experience, but I think obviously when you're supporting people who are at the point of admission are very unwell and very distressed, actually the ability to work with those individuals and to support them to become well again, actually, and to see the improvements that people make in their mental health and well-being and their emotional health and well-being is quite incredible. And that, I think, working within an assessment and treatment service and really having that time working directly with people is one of the greatest benefits, I think, and the greatest roles as well, to support people.
Yeah.
Thank you. Michael, could I come over to you now and just ask for a little bit of background really to your career as becoming a learning disability nurse and your early experiences as well?
Thanks very much, Becky. I'm Michael Brown. I trained in Glasgow in a hospital called Lennox Castle. I vaguely remember it had about 1,600 beds. It was absolutely massive. There must have been about 50 wards on this great big campus. There was the male side of the hospital, and then there was a road that was about a mile long that you had to go up to go to the female side of the hospital. And at that time, none of the male students went to work in the female side of the hospital. I trained sort of in between when Ruth and Kay trained. I vaguely remember the J report, Ruth, and I remember, similar to you, the lecturer saying to us, you'll probably finish your learning disability training, but we're not sure what's going to happen after that. So go and do general nursing or mental health nursing, was the advice I remember us being given. My first day was in the School of Nursing. There was about 24 or 25 of us in my class. Nearly everybody finished. And it was, I remember being in the college, in the School of Nursing for 8 to 10 weeks to begin with, and being taken across to a ward to get shown how to make beds was one of the things that I remember. Before I started nurse training, I come from a family of nurses, doctors, lawyers, and ministers. I didn't really want to be any of the other ones. And my mum was a medical ward sister in the local general hospital. And she sort of facilitated a job over the summer as a support worker. And that was in a general hospital. And I enjoyed it. And I was thinking about becoming a nurse. And everybody used to say, oh, you'd be a really, really good nurse. And I remember my mother saying, well, what kind of nurse would you like to be? And I just assumed naively that everybody was a nurse like she was as a adult nurse. And then I did a little bit of background reading, mental health, learning disabilities. I was drawn between the two of them, but I decided to apply for learning disabilities. There had been some patients with learning disabilities in the medical ward that I had worked in, and I had volunteered in the evening before I left school. So I had a little bit of contact with them, applied to this, what I can only call as a massive institution on the outskirts of Glasgow. We used to get the Lennox Town bus number 175, and it took 45 minutes from Glasgow city centre to get to the institution. It was in the outskirts of a village. It used to take about 10, 15 minutes to walk into the village. Lived in the nurses' home there. And my first ward after the School of Nursing was Ward B. And I went to that ward about 5 times during my nurse training. And I got to love that ward, but I remember getting shocked actually when I first went. There was 60 beds and there were probably 4 to 5 staff per shift. And we used to bath one half of the ward one day and the other side of the ward the other day. And I remember making 60 beds on my own. That's some of the kind of things that stick out in my mind. The training that I did, we did medical, surgical, mental health, children, learning disabilities. So we got an all-round experience. My first staff nurse's post was in a unit for children and young adults with profound and multiple learning disabilities, which was not in the hospital I trained in. I'm from Edinburgh, and I went back home after I had finished. And then after a year working in that unit, I get transferred to the male locked ward, which was from one extreme to the other, which wasn't such a pleasurable experience as I recall it. I then applied for general nursing, very obedient, because the College of Nursing and people said, oh, you should go and do general nursing just in case. So I did the general nursing course, and I worked in general nursing for about 2 years, mainly on night shift after I finished in high dependency and acute medical receiving, which was interesting and enjoyable, but I knew that it wasn't ultimately where I was going to stay. I think that no education or training is ever wasted, and I'm pleased that I did it, but I knew that I wasn't going to stay in it. I really missed learning disabilities a lot. The big institutions were still there. There was talk of the hospital closure programs, but they hadn't started at that point. And I knew I did not want to go and work again in an institution. And at that time, the Long Stay Learning Disability Hospital, which had begun to close, had started to invest in residential services and community learning disability teams. So I applied for one of the, what was the G grade, or the, what would they be now? They'd be a band 7 post in a community team. And I did that job for several years, worked in practice development, worked for the government and civil service, worked in public health. And before, and then I was a consultant nurse for about 17 years. Half of that was as a joint clinical academic, as a professor, half the week, and then a consultant nurse the other week. And then I moved to Belfast about 6 or 7 years ago. So that's a kind of potted history of where I've been and what I've done. I don't think any of the experience, a bit like what Ruth said, has ever been wasted. I've enjoyed aspects of it more than others, but I think there's learning and experiences to be taken from everywhere that I've been. Probably the two roles that I've enjoyed the most was the community nursing role and the consultant nurse role. They were probably the two, if I had to pick, I would probably go for them, but I've enjoyed them all, and I've been very fortunate in the opportunities I've been given.
That's wonderful, thank you. I think you've really kind of demonstrated the importance of people actually not making those assumptions in terms of what nursing is, but actually to really explore the 4 fields of nursing and to identify which is the most appropriate for them. And I'll always remember a student at interview talking about how she did do that, and how she really knew actually that learning disability nursing was the path that she went to take, and it really stuck with me, that did. So thank you very much. It's incredibly interesting in terms of thinking about those different experiences that you've all had at the different stages that you started your training, working in 60-bed units with 4 or 5 staff. You wouldn't see that now, but it must have been quite a different experience. I wondered if you could share with us what has been the biggest change in learning disability nursing during your career. If I could come to you again, Ruth, and then to Kay and Michael.
Okay, I'm going to be greedy and probably go for 2. I think one, obviously is the move from the long stay hospitals where I started to the pattern of care and support that we see now. As Michael said, the large hospitals on the outskirts of towns, villages, or what have you, large wards, people very segregated. So obviously that's been a major shift. But I think alongside that, there's also the shift in nurse education for me from, schools of nursing where you just had, it was mental handicap when I did it. And, we've had various terminology, but sort of learning disability was completely separate, to moving into, as we are now, in universities with degree level education and much more perhaps interaction between the fields of nursing and education.
Fantastic, thank you. And you're right, it's been an incredible shift, hasn't it? And continues to be, actually, as we're looking at other elements of learning disability practice and
Yeah,
nursing, in
it's
terms of
changing.
advanced practice, consultant practice, and those new roles that have evolved as part, as part of that education evolving as well. Thank you. Kay, over to you.
One of the key sort of developments for me is the same thing as Ruth said. It's really about the shift from long-stay institutions to community and sort of people-focused care. And then when all sort of the closure of hospitals happened when I was training. So I saw a bit of the old system and bits of the new system during my period of training. So that was a really important change. Obviously, also given my experience in an acute adult ward and then having to care for people in the community was actually quite different experience. And I thought that was quite a major development. The other major development for me is quite current. It's really about acknowledgement of the need to support people with learning disability in mainstream services, and particularly around the roles of acute liaison nursing. I think that's a huge acknowledgement from the main sort of NHS in England, in Wales, in Scotland, in Northern Ireland, clearly that people with learning disability are important. And when they go into hospital, they need support from experts like learning disability nurses. And I think that has made a huge difference to people with learning disabilities experiences when they go into hospital. And I hope that that continues to develop. And obviously tied with that, I do think that the role of the nurse consultant in learning disabilities is actually putting quite a lot of focus on what the contribution of learning disability nurses is and how good it is. I think that has been quite two things for me.
Wonderful, thank you. And I hope that we continue to see that shift, Kay, as well, in terms of actually, from a society perspective, in actually valuing and supporting people with a learning disability as well. Thank you. Over to you, Michael.
I think I agree with Ruth and Kay, the kind of deinstitutionalization. I think people of our generation, if I can use that phrase, were a part of working in the institutions, a part of the institutional closure, a part of the development of community health services, and which, and I think for me, the biggest development has probably been around the range of roles that learning disability nurses can and do take on. And we've all probably experienced, well, what do learning disability nurses do? All that kind of boring stuff that I get fed up hearing about. But there's a lot around children, about respite care, around children with complex needs, working in CAM services, looking at the transition roles, looking at the liaison roles. I mean, when I finished nurse education, it was an institution-based job. That's where everybody went. And now I think the kind of range across the lifespan, the ranges levels of kind of practice, I think that's probably some of the biggest and most important changes that I've kind of seen. And it really fascinates me with the students when I worked in Edinburgh, now at Queen's, where their destinations are and where they go and the types of roles that they take on. And it just makes me feel really proud that they're kind of really inspiring people and there's so many opportunities for them. So I kind of really focus in on those kind of changes that I've seen.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good example, actually, from moving from institutionalised care into community services, but actually the vast array of different roles that learning disability nurses are undertaking. And I think, the passion and the strength in value base of our learning disability nurses as well. And I think, the work actually that all of our HEIs have undertaken, and through positive commitments and positive choices and lots of other forms as well, to strengthen that voice has been incredibly powerful. Thank you very much. So my next question is, who has had the biggest impact on you as a nurse and why? And I'm going to come back to Ruth again and then to Kay and Michael.
I think that's a really, really difficult one to answer because people probably have impacted on me, for different reasons in different settings. Probably it's not a single individual. I think probably the people that have had the most impact on me have been people with learning disabilities themselves. and what, you know, their experience, sharing their experiences with me, teaching me, helping me to learn. So say very, very difficult one, because I'd also probably put in there students, because I think, you know, working with students, I think is a great privilege. You know, having the opportunity to discuss, to debate, to be challenged, that also has an impact on me. So difficult question.
It is. It's not easy to just name one person, is it? Kay?
Well, I think a very similar view is that I've had a lot of people with who have made a huge impact in my career, and including Michael, including Ruth. I think Michael remembered that I interviewed you for my PhD, and I think that was a wonderful experience.
Okay.
And Ruth, I can't say any more about your involvement in my career. And I think there is something about my very initial experiences. And I think one of the people who impacted me was actually a patient who was very aggressive, who kicked me and harmed me. I lost a bit of my tendons in my knee. And really, at that time, at the beginning of my career, as I said earlier, that I didn't quite understand mental health and how it affected people with learning disabilities. And I think working with a person like that and sort of leading to a significant injury, which I still carry today, really made a big difference to how I understand the complexities of the needs of people with learning disabilities, and how we need to accept them for what they are rather than actually what we think they need to be. So to me, there's a passion there. And also right at the beginning of my career, I supported a lot of students to do NVQ courses. I'm sure some of us remember those courses, which gave people access to do learning disability nursing. And I had worked with a lot of support workers who were great, who were wonderful, who influenced how I looked at how people can develop to become something different, and how they can become people who work with people with learning disabilities. But obviously, also in terms of my professional development, my professional career, there were people who made a huge difference in terms of how they supported me to develop individually. Least but not all is, of course, Professor Bob Gates, who was my supervisor for my PhD. I worked with him as a line manager, and he made a huge inspirational difference to me as an academic, as a clinician, as a people, as a person working with people with learning disabilities. He was just all-rounded career professional, ultimate professional learning disabilities nurse.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Michael?
I think from a bit like Ruth, there's been so many people, but there is one person. I was at an event a few years ago, a conference, I think, and one of my friends came up and said, there's somebody from the past that wants to meet you. So I thought, well, that's very intriguing. And it was the sister from the children's ward when I was a student, Sister Manison. And I remember her vividly because she was one of these people that was such a positive role, model that you really wanted to be like, just in terms of the way that she conducted herself, the way that she behaved, the standards that she had, the way that she treated people. And I've never, ever forgotten her. And I hadn't seen her for decades. And it was just such a thrill to kind of see her. And she said to me, it was really quite humbling. She said, you're one of those students that really stood out. And I've no idea then, because it was like donkeys years ago and I was just another student. But she was one of those ward sisters that really influenced me. And I thought I'd really like to be just like her, because she was such an inspirational person. So she stands out.
I think you highlight something so important there, Michael, in regards to actually the importance of role models, throughout our careers. Obviously we learn from the people that we're supporting all the time, but those role models and our role and responsibility as role models is so important, isn't it? And that leadership as well from others. I agree. It's certainly been inspired. I couldn't miss the opportunity to be with yourselves this evening, because you're three of the people that have inspired me, and so continuing with the role modeling would be fantastic. Could I ask, what would you say was your proudest achievement in your careers to date? So I'm gonna keep to the same order if that's okay. I'll come to you, Ruth, and then Kay, and then Michael.
With that question, I think I'd probably have to say being made a professor of learning disability nursing, because that wasn't a role which I'd ever envisaged having. That role didn't exist when I started my nursing career. Wasn't a role I'd ever envisaged holding. At the time, there were professors who were working in learning disability departments, and there were also professors of nursing who were learning disability nurses, but that actual title, to have the professor of learning disability nursing, to me was something I was very proud of and felt very privileged to have. And I think it's opened up so many opportunities to work with such a wide range of people, and hopefully, you know, work with people to make a difference. So for me, it would be being able to work in that role for a number of years.
And a fantastic achievement as well. And I think for myself, being able to look up to actually people like yourself, Ruth and Kay and Michael, in those professor roles is really important as well, and knowing what the potential is and what we can achieve as learning disability nurses. So thank you. Kay.
Yeah, I think it's very similar sort of experience, and I didn't do A levels. I didn't do sort of things which prepare you to go to higher education. So I went the long way of not having A levels and having experience and doing a master's from a diploma. I didn't do a first degree. Some people might be surprised that I actually didn't do a first degree. I just finished my diploma and argued that I qualified to, of course, at the time, you needed to demonstrate in an interview that you can start at level 7, which is what I did. And I managed to get a master's degree and then on progress to achieve a PhD. And I do think that, of course, having professors of learning disabilities is very rare. And I think I was the second professor of learning disability nursing at the University of West London after Bob Gates. There was nobody else. And I think it's a massive achievement. And what that, again, like Ruth, what opportunities I got as a result of that to do work for Department of Health and Public Health England, or I would never had that opportunity. And that is not just to do with the reports and the work I'm doing for those organizations, but it's about the impact that work has on people with learning disabilities, on learning disability nurses and students and so on. It's immense. And when you see your work sort of influencing people from across national boundaries, then you really think, yes, we are making a difference. I think that's really one of the greatest achievements. And I think I'm making a difference to people with learning disabilities and the profession as a whole. I think it's a huge achievement.
It absolutely is. And actually, you know, being able to use your doctorate, you're becoming a professor, and actually, you know, leading research and leading that evidence-based practice so that we can ensure we're delivering, you know, good quality services for people is so important. So thank you very much. Michael?
I think the best way to answer is there's two perspectives of it. There's things to me personally, and I think registering as a learning disability nurse was a very proud moment. Getting my first degree, I did the first degree, Kay. I wasn't smart enough like you to jump up to the masters, I don't think. But graduating with the first degree in health, what management and social sciences is what my first degree is in, something like that anyway. And that was very proud because it was a bit of a slog, and I was the only nurse in the class from what I remember. And so that was a proud moment. And I think in terms of influencing, doing the liaison nursing research and setting up the roles with colleagues in acute care, that was back in 1996 that we started that work, nearly 20 years ago. And to see that the roles have evolved and developed and taken their own shape in all kinds of different settings, I feel very proud of that and quite humbled by it, because it came about as a system failure, where a patient with learning disabilities was admitted to acute care and it all went dreadfully wrong. So the nurse directors in acute care and primary care where I worked recognised that more needs to be done here. And that's the start of a journey that we're still on now, that I don't know if it'll ever finish. And then a bit like Ruth and Kay, getting the doctorate and then being a clinical sort of professor with a consultant nurse and the professorial chair, that was a big personal achievement for me as an individual. I never, ever in a million years would have, when I started out and as that little boy in that institution, ever would have predicted that that would have happened. But the monster you see before you now is a part of all these different experiences.
Brilliant, thank you, and what a monster you've become. I think it's really exciting, isn't it, when we think about the continuing development of new roles actually and how we're changing as learning disability nurses and adapting as learning disability nurses to those roles and making a difference is so important. So thank you very much. I'm going to come to another question, and I just wondered, what do you wish that the public and other nurses knew about learning disability nursing? Over to you, Ruth.
At a very basic level, I wish the public certainly knew about learning disability nursing, full stop, because I think there's still so many people, even, you know, when we have students who are coming to universities who sort of said they'd almost found out by accident, they didn't know that you could be a learning disability nurse, because, you know, the images which you see of nurses and nursing perhaps in the media, when you talk to people, their images of somebody who works in a hospital. You know, if it's on the news, they're usually either giving out drugs or sort of putting a drip up or something like that. You know, there's never a piece in the public domain which says, you know, we're talking about nurses and they actually show a community learning disability nurse, for example, visiting, you know, somebody that they're supporting. So I think I wish that they knew that was the option of learning disability nursing. And I think a lot of the work which learning disability nurses do when it's done well is often invisible. You know, to somebody else, they may just see you with somebody and think, well, what are they doing? And the classic, you know, I come from a community nursing background, and it was like, well, you know, community nurses, all you do is drive around in cars all day and drink cups of tea. Well, yeah, you might be drinking a cup of tea, but at the same time, you're assessing the environment, you're assessing the person, you're talking with them, you're trying to sort of set goals with them, you're assessing their health. But all of that to somebody looking in was invisible. So I think it's about knowing that there are learning disability nurses and knowing the contribution that they can make to, particularly to the health and well-being of people who are sometimes very underserved by health services.
Yeah, absolutely. So raising that awareness actually of learning disability nursing across our society, such an important you know, topic, isn't it, really, for us to be thinking about? And I think lots of work that we can be doing to continue to raise awareness. Kay?
Yeah, I entirely agree with Ruth, but I think it's really important that the society, the members of the public themselves, know about people with learning disabilities. I think that's an important starting point, and it's about really how, if society does not accept people with learning disabilities, it will be very difficult for them to accept learning disability nurses. And I think therein is the issue for me, that we really have got a society which does not accept disability, or which does not accept different people. And I do think that if we have got a society which understands learning disability and which accepts learning disabilities, then we wouldn't have a problem society understanding learning disability nursing. The reason why there's a problem is because there's a poor understanding of people with learning disabilities, and that they're people first rather than sick people who need this, that, and the other. And I think if we have a voice, I don't know, Prince William, Prince Harry on mental health, maybe we have a society accepting learning disability, probably somebody who has got a voice to make it clear that people with learning disabilities are important.
Thank you, Kay. Michael?
There's a few things, Becky, I would say. I wish the wider public knew all the opportunities there are for learning disability nurses. I think there've never been more. When you think about children, transition, liaison, mental health, behavioural support, neurodevelopmental, right through to end of life and older people. It's just phenomenal the way that roles have evolved and changed. And the other thing, I said at an event, and it was out my mouth before I said it, and it's out there, but it did get a reaction. I wish people knew how funky and sexy learning disability nursing actually is. And I think, to me, it's one of, and this is a former adult nurse, I can get to say these things, that I think it is probably nursing in its truest sense, enabling, supporting, improving, facilitating, all of those kind of words. And I think when it's done well, it just makes you feel really, really proud.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Obviously, we've been through a particularly challenging time over the last few years, last couple of years, and still are to some extent. So I wondered whether you could kind of share your thoughts in regards to what impact that COVID-19 has had on learning disability nursing and, most importantly, people with a learning disability.
I think for people with a learning disability, I mean, it's a difficult one because people with a learning disability are a very diverse group. So I think the impact has probably varied depending upon people's circumstances, but I think there are some probably general impacts that you can see. And I think one of those is the fact that it's highlighted even more some of the health inequalities which people face. You know, it's put a very sort of sharp focus on that. And I think alongside that, I think in terms of learning disability nursing, I think what struck me as we went into the pandemic and everybody had to change their ways of practice was just how amazingly innovative and flexible learning disability nurses were. I think, you know, things that sometimes would have taken months, years to change in practice, all of a sudden people really got behind it and thought very much of different ways of doing things, different ways of delivering things, because what they wanted was to ensure that the people they were supporting got that support that they needed. So I think there's probably been pluses and minuses in the situation, but I think we're also now probably experiencing the longer term effects of COVID on people with a learning disability. And I think, you know, as I say, those health inequalities were existing beforehand. You know, I worry that there's been an awful lot of unmet need, undetected need, which may lead to even more situations where things are diagnosed later for people with learning disabilities.
Thank you. I think that's one of the greatest concerns, isn't it, is actually the impact on identifying healthcare needs for people at too late a point, really, and something that we all need to be acutely aware of. I was just thinking about how actually the learning disability nursing workforce was so able to actually work across multiple services and to flex, and it just showed the adaptability of the learning disability nursing workforce, didn't it? Kay.
Yeah, just speaking on what you're saying, Becky, because that's exactly what I was going to talk about, is from a learning disability nurse point of view, that really COVID has illustrated how adaptable learning disability nurses are. If you look at some of the activities, interventions they had to undertake or to be able to support people with learning disabilities and beyond, which they never used to do before. I think it is a huge positive impact in terms of how learning disability nurses demonstrated their skill set and how adaptable and quickly they can learn to practice in very difficult circumstances, which I think in a lot of cases it was very, very difficult. I think as general members of the public, we found it very difficult to cope with some of the restrictions, and imagine how learning disability nurses were able to support a lot of people with learning disability and kept them safe. I think it was a huge achievement in terms of being able to support people and teaching them to adapt to the changing living environment they found themselves in. I think in terms of people with learning disabilities, I do think that it is a huge impact. I know a lot of people who did not survive the COVID situation. I do think that that has a huge impact on people with learning disabilities and their families and so on. And I do think, and I agree with Ruth as well, it's about the long-term impact of all this and what it means for the future, because it doesn't look like we are out of the hoods yet. I don't know. I think most of us we look like we are over 50 and would have had our new invitation in England for another booster. And I do think, and people with learning disabilities are the same. It's about what are the long implications for this? When is it going to end? And how much support do we need to continue to give people with learning disabilities to keep them safe?
Thank you, Kay. I think you raised some really good points there, you know, in terms of the level of restriction for somebody with a learning disability. Still, you know, there's a higher level of restriction if somebody is living in social care, isn't there? And in terms of that isolation, we may isolate within our house, but actually somebody might be isolating within a room, and how difficult, challenging actually that is for people. So thank you. Michael.
I think, Becky, that was the point I was going to pick up on. I don't think we can begin to imagine what it was like for somebody with learning disabilities, with behaviours that challenge or behaviours of concern, or people with ASD, where their routine and their networks as a result of the pandemic were majorly kind of impacted. I mean, that happened to all of us, but I'm trying to think about somebody with learning disabilities whose maybe insight and understanding maybe was impacted, and then what did that mean for the people who provided them with care? And I think throughout my career, one of the recurring themes is having to argue and advocate for equality of access. And I think as the full extent of long COVID starts to sort of unfold, there's services being set up across the UK to address the needs or try and provide assessment and interventions. I think as learning disability nurses, we have to ensure that the people that we support and that we care for have equality of access to whatever is being provided for everybody else. And I feel very confident in our skills to do that, because I think we're very professional with our elbows in getting in there and advocating and ensuring. And I think many of the roles that learning disability nurses are fulfilling now will place them very, very well in that advocacy, equality of access. And ultimately, it's not just about access, it's about equality of outcome. So I think those are some of the things that I think we'll have to keep a close eye on. And certainly I hope that learning disability nurses will talk about it, will share through their networks, they'll write about it, they'll speak about it, and that we'll share the sort of lessons that we learn about what actually works.
Thank you. I think absolutely, in terms of actually the longer term impact, it's not just the current impact, is it? But that longer term impact could be quite significant, and ensuring that that's recognised for people and that people are supported to be able to access those services in the right ways. Thank you very much. Now I've got one final question, and it is the most important question. So I wondered if you could tell us about a time that you learned something from one of the individuals with a learning disability that you've supported.
Yeah, I think I'd probably give an example from working with people to do research. And again, historically, people with learning disabilities were not seen as being able to participate in research, let alone do research. When we wanted to know their views, we went and asked other people. But having the opportunity and the privilege to work alongside people doing research, and particularly looking at how we analysed some of what we got back, because what was really interesting was that the people I was working alongside, they'd found their own ways of doing that. They found the ways, they knew the principles, but they worked out their own ways of doing the analysis. And I can always remember one discussion where we were looking at something and we sort of said, oh, well, that's really, really interesting. And one of the groups sort of said, yeah, but that's looking at it from the staff's perspective. That's not looking at it from the person. And for me, that was a really important one to always think about. Okay, so which perspective are we looking at here, and to try and look from other people's perspectives. So for me, that was a really, really important lesson.
Thank you. Absolutely, and I think another thing we need to look at is about actually how we ensure that all research is inclusive and not exclusive. And I think we can learn a lot from the work that you've done, Ruth, about how we're doing.
One of my sort of I suppose soapbox things is it's not just about trying to get people with learning disabilities involved in learning disability research, it's about how do we support them and how do we support other researchers to make sure that their voices are heard in wider research.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Kay.
Yeah, slightly different from Ruth's sort of experience. Mine is really about service users teaching student nurses, and I found they made a huge sort of difference to how I view people with learning disabilities and their ability to communicate and make people aware of their needs, and make students aware of their need to work and communicate with people with learning disabilities when they come. So we've got a wonderful group of service users with learning disabilities who can command a lecture theatre full of students who might be very rude and very rough, and they can control them, and they can actually tell them to shut up and listen to what they're saying. And I found that really sort of mind changing to a lot of students, and how we prepare them for professional practice. And these are not just learning disability students, these are students across all fields of practice: nursing, midwifery, all fields of nursing practice, nursing associates, and social workers. And these sort of people with learning disabilities really make a huge difference to how people perceive learning disabilities. And I think that's wonderful.
Thank you, Kay. The importance of actually really ensuring that people have the opportunities and, you know, they're supported around really, because I think often that's what's missing, isn't it? And we need to ensure that those opportunities are there for people. So thank you. Michael?
Mine's a little bit similar, but slightly different from Ruth's and Kay. And I was just thinking, when I was in the consultant nurse role, the clinical bit of the role was around working as a psychotherapist. So I worked a lot with people with learning disabilities who'd experienced abuse or harm or risk. And I remember a referral for somebody, a service user who I knew from the past, and I mistakenly underestimated his ability to engage in the therapeutic aspect of the care. And I just assumed, because I knew him from the past, I didn't think he would be able to. But actually his level of engagement and ability to work through many of the issues that he had still stays. And I use that story a lot with the students now. And it's about never underestimating. So Ruth's example there of never underestimating people with learning disabilities capacity and ability to understand. Actually, research is complex, but sometimes really quite simple, actually. And then Kay's point there about the students love when people with learning disabilities come in, and we get them in as often as we can, and family carers. And then for me, it was just that I was wrong in that case where I underestimated this patient, this service user's ability to engage. And he resolved many of his own problems, and I was able to facilitate that through the psychotherapy role. So I just kind of reflect back on that. We're just teaching it to the second year students recently, and I used that case example about never making assumptions and underestimating somebody.
Thank you very much. I was just about to say about not making assumptions, so to summarise that perfectly. I lied, and I have got one more question, if that's okay. So apologies, I've just got one last question, and it's a good one for us to end on. So I wondered if you could share me what your thoughts are in regards to what needs to change for the future of learning disability nurse.
I think when we're thinking about the future and we're thinking about development of the profession, I suppose it's about why do we need to develop? And for me, that's always tied into the needs of the people we're working alongside and supporting. So I think one of the things that we've got better at, but which maybe we need to be developing even further, is thinking about the people that we're supporting, what their needs are now and in the future, and then making sure that we've got the knowledge and skills which are required in order to provide that support. So I think we have shown that we're very good at changing and demonstrating that we can adapt, but I think we could also perhaps in some situations be a bit more proactive about that and think about, you know, for example, the aging population, you know, how are we actually preparing to be better supporting people who are aging with a learning disability? So for me, it's, you know, looking at needs and then making sure that we plan to meet those needs.
Great colleague of mine, one of the people that inspired me, always talked about that horizon scanning and looking ahead. So really a good example there. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, I entirely agree with Ruth there. And I think for me, one of the key things is really just related to what Ruth was saying, but it's about how do we take the profession forward ourselves? And I think it's really important that we look at how we develop leaders among ourselves who are actually able to research, who are actually able to demonstrate the contribution of learning disability nurses, who are able to investigate the needs of people with learning disabilities and how complex they are becoming, to be able to publish those papers in peer-reviewed, sort of creditable journals, so that if we are questioned, people doubt about our contribution, the evidence is there, and we are the only people who can do it, not anybody else. That's the way I look at it.
Thank you.
I think, Becky, if a bit like what Ruth was saying, if we go to that evidence of population and demographic and need, we're seeing at both ends of the age continuum, increasing complexity, neonatal survival, increased neurodiversity, neurodevelopmental disabilities, as well as learning disabilities, with comorbid other health concerns. Part of our roles lie there. And then, as Ruth was saying, if you was to the other end of the age continuum, we know life expectancy is increasing, but it's still shorter. We know there's multiple health inequalities there. So I think all of the professional nursing frameworks around career development, I think many of the messages and the solutions are in there, and that we need to grasp these opportunities and bring together that evidence of changing need and population need, and then develop the roles with the knowledge and skills to meet the needs of individuals. I think that's what we need to focus on for the future.
Wonderful. I think you've summarised that really nicely for us, Michael. And thinking about actually, you talked earlier about the evolution of roles, and actually I think that continues, doesn't it, in terms of clinical roles and that development. So thank you very much.